Hello, welcome to the Bad Vibes Club. Thanks for joining us for 10 Texts on Sculpture. This is episode number 6. Today we are looking at the idea of entropy as it applies to sculpture, and we are doing that by reading 2 texts, one by Robert Smithson called Entropy and the New Monuments, which was published in Artforum in 1966, and one long text, a whole publication really, about the art of Beverly Buchanan, and the publication is titled 1978 to 1981 because it's looking at works from that era, which is edited by McArthur and Jennifer Burris Staton. Apologies, for some reason I just can't remember Jennifer Burris Staton's name in this episode, so I keep not saying it or saying it wrong. So just remember that McArthur and Jennifer Burris Staton edited that text that we're looking at. We go through the Smithson text first, then we go through the text, the publication about Buchanan. We talk about entropy, as you might imagine. We also talk about ruins, which is the word that comes up more in relation to Buchanan's work. We talk about the similarities and differences between the two artists, Smithson and Buchanan. Buchanan, who was kind of making work later, really, and we talk about the difference between the kind of major heroic readings of Smithson's work versus the kind of minor interventions that Buchanan was more interested in making. As always, you can download both texts from my website. There's a special link which is dekersaint.com/Bad Vibes Club. That's dekersaint.com/Bad Vibes Club. And you can read along with us. Also, I should probably say that this is almost a kind of trigger warning, or actually it's quite complex. But while describing the history of tabby concrete, which is a material that Beverly Buchanan uses, I use the term Indian, which I normally would say, I guess, Native American. And Andrea picks me up on it, and then we have a little discussion about the inevitability of me as a kind of white, all the privileges that I have being kind of ignorant about these things, but also just us as Europe, us from the context of living and working in Europe, thinking about North American art and not necessarily being in that culture, and thinking about it kind of externally, both geographically and of course historically in relation to Smithson and Buchanan. Anyway, but then I've just Googled Native American, correct term, and the National Museum of the American Indian says this: American Indian, Indian, Native American, or Native are acceptable and often used interchangeably in the United States. However, Native peoples often have individual preferences on how they would like to be addressed. So I can redact the trigger warning element of that and just say that it brings up an interesting point about us reading these texts from, a perspective that is geographically and historically far from when the work was made or the texts were written. It's a great episode, actually. Just really enjoyed looking back through it. Lots of nice little bits. And we have a kind of honorary, invisible, hovering third guest, which is our mutual friend Ross Jardine. You might know Ross because he's been on this podcast before, and me and him work under the name Radio Anti, producing broadcasts and transmissions. Anyway, he's an entropy lover. He's always loved entropy, and he really introduced the idea to us about 10 years ago as something that could be used to think about culture. And me and him, as part of Radio Anti, made an entropy mixtape, and we actually opened the podcast by playing a tiny little bit of that to think about the difference between entropy as a thermodynamic process and then the entropic processes that are more cultural and social and anthropological that Smithson is interested in and that Buchanan is also playing with in her work. All right, I will see you at the end. Enjoy the episode. So this week we're still kind of looking at legacy of minimalism. This time it's through Robert Smithson's writing, and particularly a piece he wrote. Is this Artforum as well?
Yes.
Called Entropy and the New Monuments. And we're also looking at a book about an artist called Beverly Buchanan, which was edited by McArthur, and who's the other person who edited it? Jennifer Staton, sorry. Yeah, Jennifer something Staton. Burris Staton or something. We're interested in these texts because they are a slightly different way. Well, they're another way of thinking about the legacy of these practices through this interesting idea of entropy. And in Buchanan's case, there's a lot of talk of ruins, actually. So that's a related thing. And we like the idea of talking about entropy because originally we were going to record this podcast with our friend Ross Jardine, who... How would you describe his interest in entropy?
I think it's the thing he talks the most about whenever we talk about art since we met him, which is probably about like 10 years ago. So I think, I don't know, Ross brought entropy into my life. Like I never use it as a concept. And now, it's always there.
Yeah, it's his go-to concept. Anyway, he was going to come join us on the podcast because me and him, a while back for a radio project we do called Radio Anti, recorded Entropy Mixtape, which was a mixture of music that felt very entropic to us and different ideas about entropy. And so we thought we'd begin this podcast by playing the introduction to that mixtape, which has a very good, quite formal description of entropy, as in it's based on the ideas of entropy in thermodynamics and stuff, rather than what we're going to talk about in this podcast, which is much more metaphorical, cultural ideas of entropy. Is that fair? That sounds about right.
Yeah, that sounds about right, yeah.
All structures are temporary. A brief explanation of entropy. All structures are temporary. Everything tends towards disorder. Nothing is 100% efficient. Every process wastes energy. And anything that has order, unity, or togetherness requires constant energy input to keep it in existence. The more complex the system, the more energy required to maintain it. The production of energy requires difference. The second law of thermodynamics defines work as the transfer of energy from one body to another. But because nothing is totally efficient, during this transfer, some energy is lost as heat. As this goes on, eventually we reach equilibrium. The whole universe will end up at the same temperature. If everything is at the same temperature, then you can't do anything useful.
Okay, and then I can do a nice fade on that. How do I stop sharing sound? There we go. Okay, so that's summarized and paraphrased from different bits that we'd read. But the point being, I think the second law of thermodynamics is that the energy is more easily lost than gained. And so things tend towards a state of equilibrium where, you know what I mean? I don't know. How would you describe it? What was your understanding of entropy before you read these texts?
So I had the most amazing conversation with my son, Oscar, who is reading on physics. He's reading to physics now. And then he turned to me and he said, well, Mom, in Aristotelian physics, which apparently is a very old-fashioned type of physics, you would describe it as everything wants to rest. And I just thought that was such a nice vibes of a description. Everything wants to rest. So I kind of I'm embracing that as my understanding of entropy. And I think before we go to the text, I just want to talk a little bit about, the larger context of why I was interested in reading it, which is, I think we have selected, maybe we haven't made this clear, but every text we have selected, it comes with a specific, it pays attention to specific aspects of sculpture or sculptural thinking that we're interested in. The idea of entropy was an idea, not just talk about, go back to minimalism and Smithson's, but to talk about maintenance, the labor of maintaining sculptures, the labor of who does that labor, which is something that we haven't talked that much, the whole process of conserving sculptures, the way materials experience time, the way certain sculptures are taken apart and put back together in different moments, and certain sculptures are kept as a whole, the kind of artists that embed process of decay in their structures. And then again, who does the maintenance? Because a lot of them kind of think about decay that is constantly happening, but that is not possible in terms of entropy. At some point that decay ends and then someone has to rejig it. And then the other thing was writing as a sculptural practice, which is we can talk about more in the text, but like Smithson's write in a very, very specific way, like very peculiar way. Yeah, so I just wanted to like set that up, because I think a lot of these questions, they're not, like Smithson's is not necessarily thinking about them, but they are present in his practices, in his writing in like an indirected way. And I think those concepts are important when we're thinking about sculpture in like a larger, like a bigger picture of what sculpture is. Or
yeah, I think that's really nice. Yeah, that's really good. Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the Smithson, I suppose?
I think so.
I think that just from the title and the opening line, I think it disputes the notion that the new sculpture, or, you know, minimalism and postminimalism, breaks with the concept of monumentality. That's Rosalind Krauss's kind of neat story of modern sculpture, isn't it? That it gets rid of the notion of the monument. But from that opening line, Robert Smithson saying, no, there's just this new kind of monumentality, and it's a monument to the future, or, you know, rather than the past. There's all these references to different kinds of why this kind of sculpture is actually a continuation of sculpture in general, rather than a rejection of sculpture as it has been described. So I thought that was important to say, because that Rosalind Krauss text is really central to the way I understand sculpture in the 20th and 21st century. But it's also like got these big claims which are disputed by the artist that she's talking about, which we've already mentioned in the previous podcast. But I thought that was quite funny that he kind of does that in the first in the title.
And he repeats that thing again, right? Where you're like constantly hearing about Staton and Malevich and all this genealogy that Krauss was very insistent that was not related to those artists at all. Yeah, I mean, I started, that's one of my first notes is like, oh, monuments, here we go again. Like that. I think there's something, sorry, this has nothing to do with anything that I wrote on, but there's something really interesting, even if like they have different positions towards monumentality, to go back to the monument at this kind of like iconic place where sculpture begins. What Smithson is doing by like starting with the monument, in a way, to me, is kind of like doing this weird expansion that is happening in the 60s in lots of places. I know it's happening in Peru and in Brazil, and I'm sure it's happening all over the world. So I think there's a lot of writing about how Smithson is unique. Well, obviously, it's always a lie. It's always already wrong. When people are living between this tension of, they have these very, you know, classic ideas of what art is, or like models where you put stuff in. And they have realized, no, this is the time where, I don't know, Namjoon Park is doing like TV work. There's like, you know, people are taking LSD. The world is changing. Everything is changing. Time is changing, which I think is a big context for this. This is the 60s. Definitely. It's like time is accelerating. There's a reason why, you know, entropy is there. So what he's doing is he's talking about the monument. And then he's saying, well, you know, he did this work when he goes and photograph the monuments of Passaic, which is this place in New Jersey where he grew up. And there's just like photos of like urban building sites and this detritus or something. So he's like, I'm going to use expanded, which is a weird, I don't know, maybe it's just a remain from the Rosalind Krauss text. But yeah, he's like seeing how much stuff, or like how much he can like modify this word monument to like include these different things and kind of resignify it. It's like he's making it into something else, which I think is one of the interesting things of the text for me. Yeah,
that's interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose most of these artists working in the 60s will have had, if they went to art school, they would have had a very, I don't know what the phrase would be, but like a very traditional, very quite conservative art historical model that they were given as part of their education. And they're having to work with that, like we all have to work with what we were taught at school and what we were taught at college and university or wherever we went. So yeah, that's a really nice way to think about it. He's kind of using the concepts that he already has, which are quite straightforward concepts around sculpture, and then trying to expand them. And then I guess maybe getting to the point where they start to break up or do something quite interesting. One of the things that I was going to say that I forgot in that intro when I was talking about Peru and Brazil is that those are like very non-universalist moments as well. So there's a moment in which, you know, the monument comes from Europe and it's like this universal concept that should be the same everywhere. And the same way that, you know, Peruvian people are saying, oh, we have like all this indigenous culture and have all of this other stuff. Smithson is saying, like, we're in the US, like, you know, we have like shopping centers and we have cities and we have science fiction and popular culture and we have all these other things. So that's also really interesting to me. Like the title of the text he wrote about the Guide to the Monuments of Passaic is, has Passaic replaced Rome as the eternal city? And it's very specific, right? It's like, you know, can New Jersey be the new Rome? And there's something really,
or like, I don't know, it's not probably New Jersey, it's probably somewhere close to New Jersey. But there is a kind of, this is what I say about like things are not necessarily in the open in the text, but there's some political and like other questions that are like underlying this thought that are really interesting. And I think that kind of like transition from Europe or from like certain classical art traditions to like the US, and then kind of like resituating and rethinking those in this different societal form is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the main takeaway I have from the text, is him very much contextualizing what can sometimes appear to be quite formal developments in sculptural practice in, basically pop culture, suburban sprawl, just all the stuff you said, like consumer capitalism, all of these specific developments in history in the 50s, in post-war America. So that's the important thing, right, is that he's doing a lot of that work, which then Krauss and other historians of this time, art historians of this time, are kind of trying to undo with their more universalizing or kind of bigger ideas about the impact of that work. But yes, I mean, there's an amazing amount of references in this text. I mean, too many. That's part of the issue with this text, is that it's kind of flabby for that. But there's a huge number of artists mentioned. There's all these quotes about time and space and entropy, which are taken from a vast range of writers. And then there's like lists of movies, which are all these kind of B movie horror films and sci-fi movies and stuff that I guess he just enjoyed and thought were cool. But we'll get to that. But it's quite crazy, like the range of things that he's referring to in this essay, which makes it quite hard to read at some points. Do you agree with that? Like,
oh my god, it's so hard to read. I think this text is so hard to read. I have to I keep Googling things. He never references anything. He doesn't give people's full names. You have to
loads of the artists I just couldn't find for ages.
And the other thing I realized, so this is the third time I read it this morning, is that it's like a conspiracy theory way of writing. So like everything has this really light connection. You can imagine like Smithson having the wall with like the red thread connecting things. And he's like, oh, and then, Andy Warhol likes this film, and this film is about entropy, and then entropy is about this physics, and then Duchamp did something with physics, and he just like goes, and it's like everything's connected, but nothing is connected. It's just like, he's just into all these things, and he's kind of like putting them next to each other. And I think that's hard when you're trying to find meaning, and meaning is not there in that way that you're used to find it.
I mean, there's definitely something to it, but I completely agree. But it's definitely an artist writing, and a really key point in Smithson's career, right? So it's before he makes Spiral Jetty, and probably when he's transitioning away from making like gallery-based artworks, and is going to move into this bigger thing of working with landscapes and working with big teams of like construction companies and stuff, which are the people he works with to make Spiral Jetty and other works similar to that. So it's a moment where he's obviously just really excited about loads of stuff, and a moment before he's actually going to shift his practice into a different direction. But yeah, I mean, definitely it could have used an editor, a more conscientious editor. You get the feeling that Artforum at this stage was just like giving carte blanche to like a certain group of artists who would just like send them copy, and they'd be like, yeah, we'll just print that's fine.
But isn't that cool? I keep remember like because I'm teaching this thing and reading, and then there's amazing, I forgot about it, but there's amazing thing about theory being, if we knew how to think about something, then we wouldn't need theory, like it would be clear. And I think this moment in Artforum, like this is like what, a few months or a year before they publish Fried's Art and Objecthood, and they publish in Judd, and they publish in Morris, and like minimalism is happening. It's like no one actually, I think this time, because this text forced me to research a lot more about the context of what's happening, is when I realized how much, minimalism was like weird and shocking and so, and these people are trying to sort of like justify or be like, oh, actually this is not just like random lots of boxes in like rooms. Like there's this underlying thinking that is happening that they're trying to share, but the sculpture itself is quite intuitive in a way. So they're not really sure what's happening. I think there's something, what you say, like there's something exciting about this text, because you can feel his excitement. He's trying to like, he's into all these things, and they think they're amazing, but he doesn't really know how to share them. And I think an editor would have help in the sense that no one knew how to share it. Like,
No,
you know what I
that's
mean?
a really good point. Yeah.
It's like they haven't understood it yet. So I'm quite envious of like, who is doing this? You know, what publication is Artforum 666, 67 now? Like, where are those conversations happening?
I mean, just again, like we've said this a few times about different texts, you know, he doesn't use the word minimal or minimalism in this article, presumably because it was either a coinage that still annoyed the people who had been labelled it, or it just wasn't really used that much. And of course, he doesn't also identify the historical period which we would now think about as the postmodern, because again, that doesn't really get used until I think we were almost saying it is the late 70s and early 80s when it really gets theorized as like, oh, somewhere around the 60s we entered a slightly different kind of cultural and historical realm. So yeah, he's like, really it's an essay about what we would now think about as the postmodern, right? But it can't name it because those ideas are not there to use yet. So like you say, he's theorizing without being able to like just use this big theoretical label or conceptual label to name what he's talking about. But it is really nice, and there's really nice bits as well from an aesthetic point of view where he quotes negative reviews of people that he really loves and kind of agrees with the negative reviews, but just reframes it and says, this is why this is really good. Like, these words are correct. It is vapid, it is dull, it is banal, it is empty. All these words that now would be aesthetic categories that would be worthy of sustained interest. But again, up until the 60s, well, in America and Europe, they were of no use and had not been theorized as aesthetic categories because people were still mainly talking about beauty and ugliness and the sublime or whatever. But it reminds me of some other reading that I've been doing. And, J.L. Austin, this philosopher who came up with this idea of performativity, he says around that time, I think he in the late 50s, he's giving these lectures, and I can't remember what the exact quote is, but he's basically saying we should be trying to think about the way people speak about, I can't remember what his lines are like, but different aesthetic categories like cuteness and fun and all of these words that people use to describe things in everyday language that are, not beauty or, I don't know, perfection, or I don't know, like all these words that get kind of
like sublime, picturesque, like
sublime's the
traditional
obvious one,
aesthetic.
right? Yeah. So that's another thing that happens over and over again in this article, is that he uses really, really negative words as positive descriptions of the sort of art that seems to be happening. Ultimately, there is nothing to see in Dan Flavin's work. There's something about Morris's work. Movement in Robert Morris's work is engulfed by stillness, delayed action, inadequate energy, general slowness, and all over sluggishness, which are obviously not words that would normally be associated with like a positive evaluation of someone's artwork. But here it's like, no, that is what they're trying to do, and that's what we're getting from them, and that's why it's so that's why it's so interesting to be involved in this scene.
Well, I think from the beginning, so before we get to, I think when we get to Flavin, there's this amazing thing when he's talking about instead of causing us to remember the past like the old monuments, the new monuments seem to cause us to forget the future. Instead of being made of natural materials such as marble, granite, and other kinds of rock, the new monuments are made of artificial materials, plastic, chrome, and electric lights. And I thought that was something really interesting because it's again like he's trying to explore this weird relation to the past. And I read this amazing book called Chronotopia, and it's about, well, it's like the author like proposes that all art in the 60s is about time at some level, like that's the main concern, and that Art and Objecthood, the Michael Fried's text, is about time. Like all his critiques are like all this artwork requires time, or like it takes it kind of like it deals with time, and that's the thing that bothers him. And I think that's what Smithson is trying to talk about here. And part of the thing, when he's talking about natural materials being changed for like these artificial materials like plastic and stuff because they're like an eternal present, is really funny because now 60 or 70 years have passed and actually plastic gets old really badly. Like granite just stays present forever, while all these materials that at the time look like so outside of time are actually so specific in time. And I had this thing about, a joke about, Dan Flavin, and Dan Flavin has this, he's describing this kind of fluorescent lamps, and they're like instant monuments, and he goes and he buys these lamps. It's also like, shopping as a artistic process of construction, which I think is from Duchamp and stuff.
Yeah.
And then it goes from the same Duchamp question, right? It's like you do this instant thing that is just Duchamp. And then it's like, they're going to be destroyed and I don't care because they just exist in the present. And then I had this amazing anecdote because he had this quote from Smithson, and I wanted to find it, that it says something like, my lamps will no longer be operative, but it must be remembered they once gave light. So, they would be there and then they wouldn't exist anymore. They would be destroyed, and that would be like the memory of their existence. And then I was like, oh, I want the context. So it's from his diaries, and the whole paragraph is, I can take the ordinary lamp out of use and into a magic that touches ancient mysteries. And yet it is still a lamp that burns to death like any other of its kind. In time, the whole electrical system will pass into inactive history. Oh, that was the inactive history. That wasn't the text. My lamps will no longer be operative, but it must be remembered that they once gave light. So they had like this really like relation with like impermanence. And then I found this amazing anecdote in the New Yorker on a Dan Flavin essay, an essay about Dan Flavin. And it says, in the 80s, when the Sylvania Lighting Company briefly stopped manufacturing green fluorescents, he was forced to buy up hundreds of them in order to stave off a blackout. The mini crisis was averted, by which time his assistant had a collection of more than 600 spares. But the real crisis remained. Eventually, Flavin's fluorescent tubes wouldn't be available over the counter. Today, his states help supply galleries with fresh ones, built by a custom fabricator. And if someone can verify that a burnt-out light came from a Flavin show, it might sell for a small fortune. And it's
That's amazing.
Like, right? There's something really incredible about, what those objects were doing at that time. And now that actually history and time has passed. I love it because they completely change the meaning of the work, but they don't. And I don't really understand where I stand there. Like they make these works really complicated.
Which reminds me of like, we were joking about Adorno and trying to kind of think about these big philosophies. But, Adorno's idea of autonomy, how the autonomy of art is kind of dialectically related to the fact that it's completely like embedded in its social and historical context, and that changes all the time, but somehow that underpins its autonomy. And I think that's a really good example, right? The 60s is full of these kinds of art that are somehow against the art market that's just developing. They're like, so we're doing performance because you can't commodify it. And then Rosalie Goldberg comes along and writes a whole book to canonize all this performance art and ensure that it can be, sold and bought within a market that thinks about art historical precedent. And same with Flavin is that like, in the 60s when he first starts making this work, it's like, he's just probably in his 20s, right? And he's like, yeah, cool. I'll just buy a load of lights and make stuff. And I don't care that it won't work in like 5 years. And then 30 years later, it's just like a real nightmare for, as you say, conservators and people working at museums who like have to maintain this like incredibly valuable artwork, because it was part of the reason it's so valuable is because it represents a very specific moment in art history where everything was changing very quickly.
But also because now it has a state, right? And as a state is a force of maintenance of value. Like that's the whole point of the state, is like, how do you guarantee collectors and the people who, have the rights and stuff, that they're going to have jobs and money. So you just have to like keep that value up and existing. So it's not even that when he dies, the thing can rest in peace. It can never rest in peace.
That's really nice.
So it's like, it's like a movement against entropy, which is amazing. It's like the social structures are against entropy. As, in everything in the world, that there's like this labor of maintenance that is like constantly present. And I think, like Smithson makes a visible, in an indirect way, he makes it really visible to me.
So the thing I wanted to talk about was how he brings in lots and lots of artists who feel now like they're not really related to that. I mean, I'm sure they're related to that scene in the sense they might have known each other and seen each other's work, but they're ultimately not related to minimalism and what we might think of as minimal artwork. So people like Paul Thek and I don't know Kaufman, but I looked up Kaufman.
Is that the guy? So is that the guy who has
Craig
the vitrine
Kaufman
with the flesh?
Yeah, Paul Thek. Yeah. He makes these kind of almost Robert Gober-esque in a different way, like chunks of flesh with like sci-fi little things coming out of them. I mean, they're amazing. I mean, I've always liked Paul Thek. He's a painter as well, and his paintings are really amazing. But yeah, they feel very far away from what minimalism was around that time, and they're much more about what Smithson is talking about in terms of horror movies and pop cultural influences and stuff like that. Low budget mysticism he's talking about, the blood and guts of horror movies, which are entropic in the sense that they're quite like culturally, you know, they're about rotting flesh, and they're about they're not a kind of positive vision of the human body or something like that. But then they're not really anything to do with monumentality or the new materials, because that of whatever he's talking about. What does he say? Of plastic, chrome and electric light. They're quite different artworks, but it's interesting that he's looking at those. And in fact, I even found a Paul Thek artwork that takes the piss out of minimalism. I mean, I don't get the joke, but it's like a chunk of flesh that has some writing on that apparently is like taking the piss out of all that, what Paul Thek thinks is kind of boring formalist artwork that he's not interested in at all. But Robert Smithson's like, yeah, I really like Paul Thek. And Paul Thek's like, no, this is boring. Which I thought was really sweet of Smithson to just be like, yeah, I love this artwork. And, you know, the artists themselves are like, oh, whatever. But it's just, and even, you know, like Roy Lichtenstein and stuff, who you wouldn't really expect Smithson to connect with necessarily, because Roy Lichtenstein is working with pop culture directly with the, you know, these comic book paintings and comic book. No, he's a painter, isn't he? Yeah, so it's all kind of paintings.
Yeah, and he has people like Forrest Meyer, so that's the one that I couldn't. And that's like a very high modernist sculpture. Like that's something that Clement Greenberg would like, I think, or like.
I mean, I don't know it enough more than. Oh, which one is it? Oh, that one. Yes, that is interesting, isn't it? But if you put it on Google image search, there is stuff that looks much more like.
Yeah, but this is the one that Smithson put in his Artforum piece.
Well, maybe, so. But I also wonder whether there's stuff around. You know, it's the 60s. You can't just like Google image search Frosty Myers and get up a load of images. So maybe that's the only one that Artforum could find or something, which maybe is, I don't know, maybe it's his earlier work or something. But yeah, I do agree that was the one artwork that I saw in the article where I was like, oh, this doesn't really look like the sort of thing that he's talking about.
But I think it goes back to the point that you say about minimalism not being mentioned in this essay, because I think Smithson is not into minimalism. And I think, you know, when Donald Judd, which is the one that really is the most concerned about, like, and not the word minimalism, but like, you know, saying like defining who are the people who are making the type of work that he's interested in, that is following all these rules. I don't think Smithson, you know, sculptures, the minimalist sculptures are included there. Like, I don't think he, you know, I think he's like adjacent to that. And I don't think he's placing this. I think his Entropy is like a different discourse from like Judd and Morris, and he's doing something else that overlaps. Because I think, yeah, he's a bit younger than both of them, and I think he quite, you know, clearly really likes Morris, and I think he really likes Judd. Like, they're friends, so they're kind of like, but he's not, but he's not, you know, in that group of people that are trying to define this specific, very narrow moment in time and artwork. So I think he's doing something else, and that's why, you know, from here he goes to the non-site and the.
Oh, actually, I wanted to say something, because I've just been looking through my timetable. When we're recording this is the start of the academic year, so I've just been introducing students to the modules or units that we're doing. And one session I run for my third years in Colchester is called "What is Our Field?" and trying to get students to think, to like place themselves in relation to other practitioners, and that not just being about artists, but about you know, whatever pop cultural stuff they're interested in, or filmmakers or writers, etc., etc. And this text, I mean, is just a very, very good example of someone trying to do that in relation to a really wide variety of material, you know, with all these references to different films that he likes. And yeah, just this idea that he's reading, for example, Donald Judd in a way that Donald Judd might not interpret his own work. So, for example, that thing you're saying about this kind of narrowness of how Judd might think about minimalism. But Smithson has this quote about, he's talking about printed matter. He says, maps, charts, advertisements, art books, science books, money, architectural plans, Math books, graphs, diagrams, newspapers, comics, booklets and pamphlets from industrial companies are all treated the same. Donald Judd has a labyrinthine collection of printed matter, some of which he looks at rather than reads. And then he starts talking about how Donald Judd will like translate the visual, he's looking at this printed matter and translating it into, formal shapes or whatever. So he's really talking about how the world inspires these formal ideas or these abstractions, but maybe Donald Judd would be less keen to like present his process as that. But Smithson is trying to make a case for these kind of works that might be thought of as a continuation of abstraction to be really contextualized by a process of looking out, and outward looking into the world. And like you say, like all these visits he makes, that great text about the Passaic monuments, which is much more fun and kind of straightforward. He takes the bus out, doesn't he, to Passaic, and he's like reading something on the bus, and then he just wanders around with a camera and taking photos of sewage pipes and stuff, and being like, this is a sculpture, this is a monument. And then also that's inspiration for stuff that he later does. So he's really interested in locating himself in a field of practitioners, but also saying that these are direct sources of inspiration for him. Films, art, writing, all these people, all these things that he's looking at.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is really important. I think also for students to hear is like that freedom that you have when you're looking at someone else's work, like that. There's this, I think it's the text that he wrote before this one maybe, but he has like a review of Donald Judd when he said something like that Donald Judd's surfaces are essential, and apparently that annoyed Judd to like no level. That's like the opposite, and he's like, but they are essential, and they are. I have to say I agree with Smithson there, but and they're friends. They were friends, but there's something, just because an artist said something or like a curator says something, that doesn't mean that you don't. You shouldn't trust your instincts and your own like reaction to things. I
mean, for students, it's about noting what other people think and then explaining what you think. That's the good study. That's the good student kind of approach. It's like, okay, so I think this. Can I test that against what other people think? Oh, no, it looks like other people think a different thing. But yeah, it doesn't invalidate what you think. It just means that you're thinking about it in a different way, and maybe that's your interpretation, and that's how you're going to use that process of looking and thinking as inspiration for your own work. That's how it's going to feed back in.
Can I just say one more thing before we move, which is I wanted to say something about the language. And I found this people talking about his writing and the way that like Smithson was obsessed with crystals and geology. So that's also part of what he was friends with Judd. I think they have like this kind of nerdiness in common, and people use that as a metaphor to his writing a lot and his sculpture, and there's this thing of saying like that his work and his writing, not only turn in the manner of the crystal, in turn it accumulates and encrusts, and in progressing it dislocates the original intention of meaning, but never does it dissolve or vanish beneath a shallow expanse, which is like, but I think it's really interesting. And then what other people talk about is how his writing does that as well, and the way he relates to me. I mean, entropy is defined in so many different ways that do not overlap in this essay. Like entropy is anything that he likes is entropy.
Well, that's the thing he's discovered, and again, that's the thing. That's
I've done that.
Like,
You've done that.
Of course. You like find a word and you're like, yeah, it's everywhere. Everything's entropic.
Yeah. But that sense that I think is very clear in his text. When you know his work, you get that feeling that it's the same. It's exactly the same process that he's using to do his thinking, and like a lot of people talk about him using his text as materials that overlap. So that's why you have like all these sedimental layers of like reference and things that go from one to the other and they don't connect, and it's like very intuitive. Like, so I just wanna just like to finish, just to say that I think there's something about reading the text, again, like not for the direct meaning, but for, the materiality and the way that it is constructed, that is like really, it's weird, but it's like really interesting.
Okay. Yeah. I think it's a lovely text to read, but yeah, definitely the way to read it is not, I mean, it's a mix, because I suppose we did, both of us spent ages Googling, trying to find all the artists, trying to find some of the reference. You even watched one of the films, didn't you?
Yeah, I watched Planet of the Vampires, which I highly recommend, by Mario Bava, who does like horror films, Italian horror films in the 60s. I had watched a lot of his horror films. I never watched this one. I watched it with my son. It was a very weird experience. It has like no budget. the actors all speak different languages and then they're dubbed, so they're speaking different languages to each other. Yeah, it has like almost no money. Everything is filmed on like a studio. There's no special effect. But it's supposed to be the film that inspired Alien.
Oh, right.
So it's these two ships that fly into a planet. They're following a emergency signal, and then the people in one ship all get killed, and then the other one are trying to investigate. And what happens is there's like this floating consciousness population of creatures that are like trying to bring people into that can occupy their bodies and then don't become extinguished as a race or as a species. It's worth it. It's really interesting. It's like a mixture of like a B movie, but it's like a very, very slow B movie where nothing happens, which is like exactly our friend Ross' taste, I think. Which I was like, oh, this is another connection.
Yeah, like really boring, tense. I don't know. No, that's unfair. But yeah,
I think Ross likes boring. Like Ross, and I like it too. Like we have a relation to boring a bit like Smithson have it. Like when I say something is boring, there's something quite... It's not to say that it's bad. It's the opposite. It does something weird with your attention that is not pleasant, but it's really interesting. And I think it's boring in that sense. Where you're a bit lost because where's the story or where's the action or like what is supposed to be happening here? Because it's a genre that shouldn't be like that, right? Like we're not... Yeah, it's interesting. And maybe I forgot, I have like a really good quote from Smithson from this to finish, because we're going to go to a different artist that is working 10 years later. And I wanted it as a comparison because I think she pays attention to lots of things that Smithson doesn't pay attention. But I didn't want it to do it in a way to invalidate Smithson. And I think this is like a good connection to that. So it's a quote from Smithson from A Provisional Theory of Non-Sites. And it says, "Theories, like things, are also abandoned. That theories are eternal is doubtful. Vanished theories compose the strata of many forgotten books." And I thought that was really an interesting way to think about text as well. That text also is part of this entropic process.
Yeah, and we're reading this text that's written at a very specific point in his life from, the historical point of view where basically Smithson's career is fairly short, and all of these texts to us could seem like, oh, they just describe his entire career, but they're not. They're theorizing or doing some theoretical work about a very specific moment in his thinking. And so, yeah, I agree. Like, and also because Buchanan's working later, some of this stuff has been theorized, which no doubt helps her in terms of the way she kind of places herself in relation to sculpture. But I do agree, she seems to be much more aware of like where she is getting her ideas and how she's deploying her context in artwork that in kind of land art and in abstract sculpture. I mean, abstract sculpture is a weird phrase, but you know what I mean. Sculpture that is non-representative. So yeah, so this text is actually, it's a whole little book, isn't it? Which is, we mentioned it's edited by Part McArthur and the other person that I forgot on their name again.
Jennifer Burris Staton.
Yeah, well done. So can you situate Beverly Buchanan a little bit?
So Beverly Buchanan is a Black woman, and I'm saying that because I think those two identitarian categories are important to how she kind of like conducts her practice, and also the sort of like career development that she had compared to Smithson. She is 2 years younger than Smithson, so they have almost the same age, even though their practice is kind of like start like a 10-year difference, I would say. And so she started her career quite late in a sense, and she has different jobs and kind of decides to do these things. And she has this catalog focuses on two or three, I think three different practices that he had that start around the 80s, early 80s. So it's this kind of sculpture that she does that kind of like imitates or refer to this thing that they call frustulas in the essay. I had never heard this word before. And it says, it's like when one or two structural pieces stand out that otherwise never would have been created without the process of demolition. So when you kind of like demolishing a building and like a certain piece of a wall stays up or something like that. So they highlight this kind of like tension, and is like a undemolished thing that wouldn't exist without the demolition, I guess. So that's one. And then ruins and rituals, which has like this different ruins and rituals, Is it Ruins and Rituals the name? Sorry, maybe we need to cut that. I don't remember. It's not clear from my notes.
Oh yeah, the artwork, Ruins and Rituals.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, and that's the one with where like different kind of rocks and piles of.
Yeah, Ruins and Rituals are the blocks that she makes out of concrete and like pigment that she makes from ground up bricks and stuff, and they're in piles.
Yeah, those are the piles, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you want to describe that?
Well, I suppose the important thing to say there is that they, in a way, are related to lots of the sculpture that was happening in the 60s and 70s, in the sense that they are, you could call them modular and you could call them regular, in the sense that they look like bricks. They look like cuboid forms that are stacked and arranged in different ways. But the stacking and the arranging and the way that the forms look is very much like they're smashed up old bricks. They're not, they're made to look like that. And her in her writing, she kind of talks about developing the process and ensuring that they don't look too regular and ensuring that they refer to the things that she wants them to refer to. But they are, in essence, still formal questions of how to place modules in relation to each other to form, what Robert Morris would have called a gestalt, like this artwork that can be looked at from lots of different angles, but you have to kind of think about it as a whole thing in your mind to like get the whole artwork. So it's still similar sculptural questions, but it looks very different and it has a very different set of references. Though they are definitely very close to what Smithson was talking about when he walks around Passaic and looks at all these new monuments, the sewage pipes, the broken buildings, the piles of rubble. But I mean, she's got an amazing quote, right? She just says she's always been into stones and stuff. And she says, and she's from Georgia. So she says something like, if I see some rubble, my thought is, let's see, now where in Georgia could that go? Which I just think is great. Like she wants to pick up the rubble and take it somewhere and put it somewhere. And that is kind of sounds like this fundamental question of her, of her practice. But you had a quote about Ruins and Rituals, sorry, so you should say that.
So this is Lucy Lippard in 83. So Ruins and Ritual was made in 1979, or it's kind of started being made in 79. This is the first public part of a 3-part work, the forms of which recall unburied tombs or giant reliquaries. The second part is private, hidden in the woods nearby and intended only for the searching audience. The third is still smaller and totally personal. It was buried in a river by the artist. All of her works might be read as an archaeology of the levels of consciousness. And I think the reason I originally got this quote, and we're going to talk about the third work that is in the catalog, The Marsh Ruins, is that I thought it made me think of the Tina Post book and what we were talking before about opacity and transparency, and this idea, which I think is super interesting, that comes from like Black art and Black theory of like art in the absence of light. So, art that is not made to be done or to be accessed. And I was thinking about that in relation to Smithson and the spiral jetty, which, you can't exists there. And a lot of those works, yes, they're hard to access, or they don't exist anymore, or they only exist at certain times of the year. But again, they're playing with this idea of monumentality, and they're in films and then in photographs, and they exist in the gallery, and they have like a very different relationship to visibility. And I thought was really one of the things that I find really interesting in Buchanan's work is this idea of embracing art in the absence of light, or like make work that is, it's just not even, it's when I think the bit of the catalog that she's talking about, this quote about, I see some rubble and where should I put it? Like it's in a lot of the catalog, there's this practice, but she's always making these artworks that are not really visible or for anyone other than herself, right? So she'll go to a place and she says she does that since she was a kid. She grabs some stones and she moves them and she puts the stones in a different place. Or I think there's a story about a factory opening the town where she lives, and it's a town that is like, I don't know, employing Black people at a certain position or something. She wants to celebrate that, so she just grabs 3 stones from somewhere else and then she puts them there, and she doesn't tell anyone. And you imagine that some of these stories exist as stories, but the impression that you get is that there are loads of these things that have happened that are not, they have never been made legible. And I just thought that was a really interesting counterpoint of ways to navigate. In some way, we tend to think about, invisibility or like illegibility again, or like opacity or transparency in the Tina Post sense as something that is like a defect, or like what we want in art practice is visibility. And I think I'm quite interested because I teach at an art school, which is all about, degree show, which is all about visibility. And in a sense, we reinforce that into students, like the idea that that moment of visibility is really important. That there's all these other really interesting ways to practice in like transparent ways or in opaque ways that construct really interesting, aesthetic experiences.
And obviously the title, Ruins and Rituals, it has ritual in the title, which brings us back to Barbara McCullough's film Shopping Bad Spirits and Freeway Fetishes, which is made exactly this, made in 81, right? So it's the same time that Beverly Buchanan is working.
Yeah, so that work, Ruins and Rituals, is exhibiting the exhibition that Anna Mendieta organizes about thorough women artists, and Sengan and Goody is on that exhibition. So
yeah, I saw that.
All of that, it's...
And that thing of ritual here being, it's not explored so much in the McCullough film, but here being a private, maybe not entirely private, but like a semi-private form of activity that you don't have to make visible. So this idea of like part of the work being buried somewhere else that no one can see. And yeah, being like maybe a practice that can happen without an audience, which, I guess because of the kind of racial politics of the time, was important for black artists who might not have had the visibility that their white peers would have had in terms of being in magazines like Artforum, being able to just like phone up the editor and be like, hey, I've got this idea for text. So I mean, they're really interesting works. I mean, we should definitely talk about the fact that she was working in public health for like 10 years before she got her first, after that she became a successful commercial artist, so it's not like she was working without an audience, but the idea that she was kind of had to maintain a practice alongside presumably a very demanding job that wouldn't have left her loads of time to like make art. So that's obviously important in the sense that how do you maintain a practice alongside having to make money because your practice doesn't make you money? So she developed ways of working that are obviously personally fulfilling alongside being fulfilling because you get to go and have an opening and get people to look at your work. I mean, that's present. If we move on to Marsh Ruins, which is the work that is one of the works that's really the focus of this book. The story of Marsh Ruins is that she gets this Guggenheim, I can't remember, basically a grant to do it, but there's not really a mention of, like whether there was an audience or whether, she got anyone to come and see it. It's like she does a report for the, she does her like, what would be over here would be your Arts Council evaluation report. And it's really beautiful, the thing she makes, this kind of publication with photos and writing, and it's on translucent paper and all of this stuff. But it's not clear to me that people went to look at it. Obviously, you'd imagine that she at least took people out there to see it. But I mean, the work itself is quite interesting. If you can Google it, it's this tabby concrete, which is a very specific material, which we could talk about, but made to look like, I guess, kind of rocks that are like lost in the marshes. And then does it get submerged in the tide, or is that so it's already this work that's meant to kind of disappear or be part of a landscape. And if we think back to Krauss's idea of sculpture being neither landscape nor architecture, well, actually here it's both landscape and not landscape in that kind of term. But I'm really not clear on what audience it had back then in sculptural form.
I think one of the things that is interesting about audience are the Marsh Ruins. And I was reading, so After All Books has a one art book dedicated to that. And the person who wrote went there, so it still exists. You can still find the Marsh Ruins, but they're not signed. There's not like marked or anything like that. But it's actually another reference that I found is that Paul McArthur, which is an artist that we're probably going to read and who edited this book, was one of the people who edited this book, has this work. So Paul McArthur is in a wheelchair and she went to visit it. And she has this work, which is a series of photos that she took from the picnic table next to the Marsh Ruins. And I thought, to me, what was really interesting is that there's like a picnic table next to the Marsh Ruins. Like, you know what I mean? That you don't have the heroic thing of like, you have to go to the desert in Utah to find, this, which is what happens with a lot of, not only Spiral Jetty, but earthworks and land art in general, right? They're like these kind of heroic trips. It's almost like, people go to Santiago de Compostela to have a spiritual experience, and art people go to these other places to have this, art experiences. And I thought it was really something really lovely to make this artwork that is sort of invisible, sort of landscape, not landscape, in a place where just, a few meters away or like maybe a little bit more, there's like a picnic table because people just go there. It's like a place, but it's not a public sculpture.
Yeah.
that operates in the sense of what we think about a public sculpture is something else. And that was one of the things I think on my last note about Buchanan was that Buchanan brings back the social to the time, and that sense in which Smithson thinks about time in a lot of really interesting ways, but the social is never really there. So Buchanan Report, which is amazing, like you were saying, it's so beautiful because it has all these photos of the different people who help her build this thing.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
That, that she paid to do the work, but also they're there, and she's like, oh, this is this person's favorite rock, and this and that, and there's photos of them, and it's really visual, that kind of like the amount of labor and collective process, and also like exchange of money and things that construct the things. Well, I think I was looking at the film from the Spiral Jetty yesterday, and it's all about, geology and time and the desert and the, and the water and all these other things. And I thought that was like a really, I'm not saying one is better than the other, I think, but it's just like they're very different ways of being in the world and thinking about your work and making work.
I mean, the way I describe it is, I think comparing materials, I mean, Smithson's Spiral Jetty is different, but comparing tabby concrete, which is a very specific material brought to North America by Spanish colonists in whenever the 16th century or whenever, I can't remember the exact thing, but it's made from burnt oyster shells, which were found in like Indian camps and stuff where they would have had eaten lots of oysters. And then it's mixed with sand. Oh, the burnt oyster shells makes a kind of lime. So it's a form of concrete, but it's made using this very specific process, which then becomes associated with slave dwellings. Is that right? There's this very specific like lineage of like how that stuff gets used, and then gets related to dwellings lived in by black populations in post kind of, not got the language, but post slave times in America as well. And so that as a material being obviously very linked to a very specific social and political context, whereas Smithson talking about plastic, electric light, and whatever it was, the other stuff that he was mentioning. And that feeling as though it's like, oh yeah, that's just like a universal thing or like a wide thing, but actually it's just another very particular material. And I think it's, from our standpoint now, we can just see that both of those sets of ideas and sets of materials are just really particular. The notion of an artist who thinks about their work in terms of like universal ideas that they think of as universal, that's just a very particular approach, just the same way as Beverly Buchanan's way of thinking about tabby concrete is a very particular approach, situated historically, situated socially, situated geographically even. And I think it's just, whenever you see someone deploy universal, you just have to think about the particular way and their particular situation and understand why they're able to and willing to and interested in deploying an idea that they think of as universal. Like that's the thing. Like, yeah, you don't have to be like, I always describe it as sad postmodernism, like the origins of postmodernism being like, oh, progress has finished. Oh, isn't it awful that like, we can no longer have progress? And then later on a more kind of positively described postmodernism, which is more about realizing that notions of universal progress or inevitable development or perfection of humanity was just a really specifically historically located idea. And it not being like, oh, I'm sad that progress is over, but being like, oh, progress maybe was something that people thought was happening at a certain time and in a certain place. So that's big rant, but yeah.
No. The thing is, and this is not, you have to cut this afterwards, but I don't know if you want to change it. You said Indians instead of Native Americans, and I don't know if that came from the text or if that's something that you feel comfortable with or that you want to change.
Oh, we can keep that in. Yeah, that's just,
okay.
I'm assuming that's just a mistake that I made in terms of, that should be Native American. I'll put like, but I think it's important that I made that mistake because that's part of
maybe you can add like a note afterwards saying like,
Yeah, I'll edit something in that tells people, oh, like I just said Indian, but I of course mean Native American, but I am like a white middle class guy from the UK. So that's exactly the sort of mistake that you'd expect me to make. Like, this is important.
I will make it as well because sometimes this stuff comes in text and stuff and it's just like how it comes through, right?
I mean, that's also not my culture in the sense that I'm not North American, so
I'm never really sure because I feel like maybe now it's okay to say it again, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think also like Native American. Anyway, we don't need to get into the specific things of like.
I just wanted to flag it instead if you didn't register.
Yeah, I didn't register that at all. But again, it's really important to note that we're looking at these American artists from my perspective as a European, as an English person, and your perspective as a South American who lives in Europe. So we're bringing different like prejudices and misunderstandings to this stuff, even now, even as we read these texts, which might seem like very written from a distant point where we can make objective claims about their work. But yeah, obviously I'm gonna make mistakes, and I'm gonna have to learn from those kind of misreadings or misrememberings or whatever. I think that's. I
mean, I feel like I haven't pronounced anyone's name right.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just rolling with it.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry. Let's go.
Yeah. No, but I agree with what you say about universality, right? And like who is it accessible to, and who is interested in it. And I have to confess, like I sort of like Smithson. I'm like I've always sort of liked him. I think, his work is interesting. But then I look at Beverly Buchanan's work and I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. I just because I am invested in those things, I am invested in like thinking about, kind of socially historical past of the place, of the materials, of the people that build it, that sort of care of like about who's going to look at it and how it's going to be constructed and how it's going to be maintained, in this case not maintained. And that is, she's actually, she's not done flaving. She's like, this is not supposed to be maintained. And I feel like these are my people. Like we kind of like, I am someone who's interested in the social. Well, not more just than that, anything right? Else.
You're interested in artists who know that they're interested in the social. Like that's also the layering. It's not just that you're interested in the social. It's like you like the fact that Beverly Buchanan, and I do too, that she knows like that she's interested in the social, and like she's using this tabby concrete because she knows it, and because she's interested in its history, which she also knows about, presumably. Like there's not loads of quotes of her talking about it, but this is a very conscious decision to work in relation to that context and that history.
And the other thing I love about this work is that it's minor, and it's like boring for us. I love minor work. I just love this thing that is just such a small, again, like Smithson is loud and heroic, and he's always like making these big statements. And when people write about, I found it so hard because everything that I found about him just writes about him as this hero, like he's this guy who died in his super young, in his mid-30s, in peak of his career, making these massive pieces. So everything is wrote as like, he's the first person to do this. He's the best person to do this. No one has ever thought about this before him. And then you get to Beverly Buchanan and she's just like picking rocks in one place and kind of like thinking about where to put them in another place, and doing this work that is so... And the photograph, like it's really worth looking at the catalog, because I think the way the work is documented, like the sculpture is documented in, again, like these domestic spaces and these stables, but it's like with such an attention, but at the same time they're so... It's like someone is spoken to you with like a really low voice and, trying... I don't know, there's something... And I do love work like that. I think it's really rare that work can do that and be incredibly effective. Like that's a really hard balance, to do work that is minor in so many ways and that at the same time really sustain itself as an object. And I have profound admiration. I just finished reading the catalog and I was like, oh my God, I cannot believe I didn't know this artist before this year. This is incredible. Yeah,
this is one of the ones we're going to upload, right? So you should be able to, underneath this podcast on the website, you should be able to click on a link and download the PDF, which features a lot of this document that Beverly Buchanan made as her evaluative document about the marsh ruins. But yeah, I mean, minor artwork is really important to me as well. Like I'm really interested in artists who aren't looking for their big idea, but are happy to develop themes that sustain them in a very different way to like, looking for... I mean, monument maybe is an important word there. Like it doesn't get mentioned in the text about Buchanan, but maybe if it is relevant here, it's about what a minor monument would be. What a monument to, like exactly what she says about the industrial factory that starts employing black workers, but she makes this monument to that event, but in a way that is still very minor, because that seems the most appropriate way. So the aptness of making minor work, right? It's not just that you can't make big work because you don't have the funding. It's like, actually, the things I'm interested require me to be thinking, if we use our phrase of weak and strong theory, right? Like, that comes from Sylvan Tompkins, and he says that this psychologist who was working in the mid-century as well, actually, and him saying that, like, if you're trying to he's thinking about emotions, and he's saying you have to have a weak theory of emotions because you have to describe them and you have to stay close to them and you have to not move away from them to describe emotions in general. And I suppose here again, it's like, yeah, if you're going to monumentalize this very particular event that happens in this very particular location, yeah, you can't make a general monument to black workers or something, which would have been, you know, the kind of old school thinking around monument. You have to make a monument that speaks to the kind of minorness of that moment, even though you think that moment is important or worth monumentalizing in some way. But again, maybe this is that thing where, like, maybe I'm trying to apply monument to her work, and you just don't need to. You just don't even need that word.
And I think maybe we're coming to a finish, but I think one of the things that I would like to go back to is, like, because the idea that art students going to listen to this podcast is that it's a really hard position where, like, young people in art school are today, because again, like, art school pushes you to, like, extreme visibility. Like, you're trained to make, you know, you're going to have the show and there's like another 100. I mean, the course that I teach has like 150 students having a degree show this year. So, you know, your work is competing, which is such a weird word, with all of these different works. And, you know, it's kind of like claiming for attention, for visibility. And then on the other hand, the other reference for art is social media and Instagram and TikTok, which is also something that is, like, very, very focused on visibility. And then the third thing, which is the other reference, is museums. And we do have a museum scene in the UK, which is interesting because I just came back from Brazil and I was like, oh my God, MASP is an incredible museum. Like, there's other ways in which museums can operate around the world. But I think in the UK scene, museums are very interested in, like, again, this idea of the seminar or the canonical, or, like, you know, this kind of, like, massive, really important thing. So there's not a lot of space for the minor. And I think the whole podcast came from this, right? Because the idea of this student, one work that is about touch and is interested in, like, the aesthetics of touch, is work that is minor. And it's like, there's no space in art school for that. And it's really, I mean, there should be. And I think, you know, if my colleagues here, they're going to be like, oh, you can't do this work. But I think it's really hard. You have to go against every structure in the institution to make that kind of work. And I wanted to talk about Buchanan, because then what ends up happening is that sometimes people that do minor, they're interested in minor aesthetics or minor work, they don't develop those. So in the end, you make something that is small and not visible, but it's also not necessarily developed as an artwork. Because there's not that space to thinking about it in that way. So it becomes like a trap. And I think Buchanan is a good reference of an example, the same way that I think, you know, the touch sculptures that we referenced from the show are good examples of, like, you can have works that circulate in these other ways and exist in these other ways, but they still have the density of art. That means you thought about it a lot and you make it a lot and you go through all the ritual and make it right and feel it right and keep pushing it and develop and arrive to those moments of complexity that can only be developed through time. Sorry, did that make any?
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think if we're getting towards the end, it brings it back to that, the more kind of straightforward descriptions of entropy from science that we started with from Ross, which is that a system or an object or a structure with low entropy is highly complex and requires a lot of energy and a lot of maintenance, a lot of work to maintain. A high entropy object is one that has fallen into complete equilibrium and would be almost impossible to distinguish from its surroundings. And I think where you want your work to be on that spectrum is up to you. You know, going back to Shopping Bag Spirits, the McArthur film, and David Hammond's talking about the work he's making in that, you know, parking lot. He likes the work that is higher entropy, much harder to distinguish from his surroundings. But he also recognizes that it might not reach the level of visibility, the level of order and structure and form that would be required to show in a gallery space. And all of these things are choices. And I suppose for students, it's about where you want to be on that spectrum, or where you feel is appropriate on that spectrum to work. And you can choose whatever, but, like, I suppose there's a kind of reality of, like, what the art world will accept as art, or what, you know, even what art school will accept as art, or, like, how many people you want to look at your art in the degree show. Because if it's touch and you only have one object and people have to sit down and touch it and you have to be there and tell them to come and sit down and touch it, you're working with, like, a high entropy artwork, in the sense that it's hard for people to distinguish what they're meant do, how they're meant to pay attention, how they're meant to interact with it. And I guess that's where you put the work in, is like how to direct your audience to give your artwork some attention. Anyway, I think it's all super interesting because, and the other final thing I wanted to say is that I thought I knew Smithson's work because I'd seen a picture of Spiral Jetty once. And actually, of course, by reading about it, I understand it more. And I thought I didn't know Buchanan's work at all because when I looked at the pictures, I was like, oh, I don't really know what's going on here. But once I read some writing around it, it helped me see the pictures better. So actually the exact same process happened, by which I learned more about the pictures that I was looking at of these sculptures that exist somewhere else by reading about them. But I thought I was doing two entirely different processes. Does that make sense? I thought I was like reading about someone I already knew, and I thought I was learning about someone new that I didn't know. But actually, I was really learning about the work and making sense of the work, which is actually really hard to access through images. So yeah, just another thing of like why you might read a text. Even if you think you know the work of an artist really well, you will always, well, as long as the text is good, you will always learn something about the work. Yeah,
sometimes when the text is bad, you still learn a lot, right?
Yeah,
just
like true.
You learn to take a position in front of that and slowly like learn to figure out to be like, oh, this is really bad. I shouldn't be, why am I reading this?
Thanks so much to Andrea for speaking with me again. Thanks to Robert Smithson for writing that text, and Pat McArthur and Jennifer Burris Staton for editing that wonderful book on Beverly Buchanan's amazing work. Thanks to Ross for being the invisible presence hovering on our shoulder, helping us think about entropy. And just to remind you again that you can download these texts from decursaint.com/bad vibes club. All right, thanks for listening, everyone. I will see you next time.